Okay, now recording. I feel like diversity and enjoyment form an important part of diet when it's a small amount of the diet. So if you just eat junk food all day, obviously that's not going to be healthy, but it's also not going to be healthy if you're just eating only like fucking quinoa and broccoli all the time to the exclusion of everything
Right.
else, and and then you just get bored and just like binge out on KFC.
Yeah, right. Do you
So,
think there's any value in being in ketosis at all? Do you think that that's something that humans should be in intermittently?
I think that ketosis is extremely valuable for certain very specific circumstances. So, for example, if you have an uncontrollably epileptic child, then a ketogenic diet has been demonstrated in certain circumstances to be of benefit. But outside of specific medical circumstances, there aren't very good reasons to be in ketosis, and it's unclear whether long-term ketosis, a state of ketosis long-term, might be detrimental to health. Not only from sort of like points of view that if you're going to do that with animal foods, you will be increasing your risk of cardiovascular disease and cancers and diabetes and stuff like that, but also from the point of view of ketoacidosis and other things which I'm not too well read into, but I have like some general inkling.
Gotcha. Well, yeah, just to kind of give you an idea of what I eat, then I can talk to you about like the seasonality and why being in ketosis intermittently is important. I mean, there's a bunch of different epigenetic studies on ketone bodies being increasing longevity, boosting glutathione, increasing mental health. Like I think it's something that we should be tickling pretty often just to remain insulin sensitive. So over consuming carbohydrates doesn't cause insulin resistance, which I think is the primary driver for heart disease, cancer, diabetes, and pretty much all of the modern diseases that we see today is all driven by excessive carbohydrates, driving insulin resistance, making you fat, making you inflamed, and having consequential atherosclerosis. But in terms of what I eat, like I ate a very high-fat diet. I eat about 2 gallons of raw milk a week. I drink about 2 gallons of raw milk a week. I turn 1 gallon into yogurt, kefir. I've been playing around with berries lately that haven't seemed to bother me. I eat lots of cheese, blue cheese, Parmesan cheese, beef tallow. I eat fish roe, batarga, which is like dry cured millet roe. About a pound of beef a day. I sometimes dabble with like red palm oil, which is ethically sourced, not the kind that displaces chimpanzees. And yeah, I mean, I try to function purely on a high fat diet, and kind of my background is I've had autoimmune issues and gut issues my whole life, and they kind of escalated a lot more in my 20s when I went to college and started consuming a lot of worse foods. Like I was drinking a liter of Dr. Pepper a day. I was eating a lot of very unhealthy foods like Pop-Tarts, ramen, like typical college shit. And towards like when I was 22, I believe, about a year before that, I was taking a bunch of antibiotics for acne and I had some other gut issues. Like I had ulcerative colitis and diagnosed Crohn's when I turned 23, but I was trying to always figure that out. And I had went vegan for about a year and a half. I was vegetarian before that, where I'd eat eggs occasionally, like sometimes fish. And yeah, I started dabbling in ketosis and getting into keto, and I was doing it mostly on a heavy plant-based diet. I was eating a lot of plant oils like avocado oil, coconut oil, pretty typical vegan or typical keto foods. And after a while, my health just kept deteriorating. Like, and I got to the point where I was shitting blood. I had pretty awful joint pain. I had back pain, and I had like weird eye floaters. I just had a bunch of different autoimmune symptoms, and I ended up listening to that Joe Rogan podcast with Jordan Peterson, and he had a lot of the same symptoms that I had. Like I used to wake up with terrible morning anxiety. I had, like I said, the eye floaters, joint pain, like lower back pain. And I thought the carnivore diet was fucking retarded and you can't live on meat. And I had believed the same typical like standard dietary advice that eating red meat too much is going to increase your risk of heart disease and that it's going to cause bowel cancer and all this stuff. But 2 weeks into doing the carnivore diet, I felt better than I had in like 6 or 7 years. Like I still had digestive stuff going on. Like I still had pretty bad diarrhea just on meat only. And kind of some like cramping problems, and I wasn't sleeping my best, but it was still better than even on just plain ketosis with plant foods. And yeah, I did that for about 3 months, and kind of during all that, like I still had a bunch of lingering symptoms, and I had read about raw milk being really beneficial and like other fermented dairy products being beneficial for gut health. So I decided to find myself a raw milk farm near me and gave it a try. And within 2 or 3 days, I had perfect stools for the first time in like literally 6 or 7 years. So ever since then, I've been kind of investigating the anthropological arguments, like how ketones affect epigenetics, like how agriculture affected human evolution, various plant defense systems and how they affect your gut, anti-nutrients. And I think that there is a hidden autoimmune epidemic that is stemming largely from over-consuming plant foods. I don't think that we're supposed to be eating plant foods for 12 months out of the year. If you follow the metric of seasonality, and I know you mentioned that you consume fruit in the summer because it's seasonally available. I don't think that we should be consuming green vegetables for 12 months out of the year. Fruit, any sort of grains. Like up until 10,000 years ago in the agricultural revolution, we couldn't do that consistently. Like we had to procure animal foods for a larger portion of the year, obviously depending upon where you live or what geographical location you're at. But for most civilizations, they had a metric of seasonality that they followed. And our genetics, our epigenetics, like how food affects your future progeny through nutrigenomics, that determines the diet like of your propagation. So if you're I don't know if you ever read Nutrition and Physical Degeneration by Weston A. Price or ever heard about it, but he had a pretty interesting observational, like just, it weren't really a study, but it was more or less observation, where he looked at cultures that were thriving, like which cultures, like he would travel around the world trying to find vegetarians initially and seeing why eating a plant-based diet might be better, but he found pretty much the exact opposite. He found pretty unequivocally that if you want to have healthy progeny, if you want to have proper facial development, no tooth decay, if you want to have proper stature, brain growth, like pretty much everything that you would consider a healthy human, you were obligated to consume animal foods. But that doesn't mean that we didn't consume plant foods intermittently or try to take advantage of calories. So yeah, I argue on the side that humans are facultative carnivores, that we are required to eat meat to be optimally healthy. Obviously, we can survive on plant foods only, being that we have a bunch of vegans and vegetarians that are still kicking, but I in no way think that they're at their optimal health. And I think more or less that if they just tried eating a bunch more animal foods, perhaps taking a month and just eating like a pound of beef a day, they would feel a massive difference in their mental health, their digestive health, their physical health. I think humans are facultative carnivores, and I think that if we don't take advantage or look back to how we used to eat and how we evolved, then you're not meeting your optimal metric of health. Like we got to be in ketosis intermittently. We can't consume carbohydrates all day, every day, and spike insulin resistance. Because I mean, there's Thomas Seyfried. He's a researcher, a doctor that has looked into the metabolic theory of cancer. And cancer fundamentally grows on two things. It's the fermentation of glucose and glutamine. Glutamine is in basically every food, like every plant food, every animal food. But just the restriction of glucose can still reduce the growth of cancer. And I think pretty much our entire cancer system as it stands, being that we have 1 and 2 cancer rates, entirely stems from the overconsumption of carbohydrates, which is also driving insulin resistance, which leads to atherosclerosis and other inflammatory disorders and autoimmune disorders. So I advocate that we're facultative carnivores and we have to eat meat.
Okay. So I just took a few notes on what you said. So obviously, because it's the introduction, I let you say everything you wanted to say, but from now on, we should probably look to address individual points rather than gish galloping each other. But it's fine that we've got some things on the table that you've just said, and I've taken a few notes on that. So on the table currently, we have carbohydrates cause insulin resistance, carbohydrates cause inflammation. You drank
overconsumption.
You drank 1 liter of Dr. Pepper a day. You were consuming Pop-Tarts. You were taking antibiotics, you had gut issues, you were diagnosed with Crohn's, you had morning anxiety, you went on an elimination diet, you had autoimmune issues which you think went away. I've
Yep.
made a note about Jordan Peterson and Michaela Peterson. You drank raw milk. You were saying that ketones were beneficial
Hmm.
for the body. You mentioned Weston A. Price, and you said that glutamine, which is amino acid, could be the main cause of cancer in relation to
Yeah,
carbohydrate
it's
consumption.
about fermentation. Yeah, like all cancer functions on fermentation. I mean, all human cells in their natural form function on cellular respiration with oxygen and other fatty acids or glucose, but the fundamental problem with cancer is a mitochondrial dysfunction that is precipitated by an overconsumption of carbohydrates, which then make the cancer cells mutate, and then they start functioning on a fermentation process where they ferment glucose or glutamine. And that's why, I mean, there's quite a bit of studies on fasting and being in ketosis being a potential adjuvant therapy to cancer treatment, as it helps signal a bunch of epigenetic genes that regulate cancer growth and like tumor necrosis suppression factors. So
Yeah, okay, sure.
yeah, ketosis
So,
is very important.
yeah, so the first thing that I would want to mention, right, there's a lot to get through. There's a lot on the table, but the first thing I want to take off the table is the idea that ketosis is exclusive to a carnivorous diet, which is obviously nonsense, as you know. You can like just fast and get the benefits of ketosis, get ketone production,
Yeah.
get all those benefits that you're talking about, the anti-cancer effects and everything which you're making a case for, just by simply not eating food, by water fasting, right? So,
Right. Yeah.
water fasting is completely compatible with veganism. So I just, we can just remove all of that issue, sweep that off the table, because that's not exclusive to carnivory. So here,
But here's
we
the
don't
thing,
have a
though.
disagreement.
Like, is there no benefit in getting all the fat-soluble vitamins, important fatty acids, all the omega-3s, omega-6? Like, is there no benefit in being in a highly ketotic metabolism while still consuming nutrient-dense animal foods? I mean, everyone that's on the carnivore diet is in deep ketosis, comfortably.
Well, this is the thing. So we agree that ketosis might be beneficial in terms of short-term effects. And the research that I've seen, it seems that you've looked into a lot of this research more than I have, to be honest. I haven't researched ketosis that much because I'm not particularly interested in the topic myself. But from the research that I've seen, it seems that ketosis is beneficial for these effects that you're talking about in the short term. But in the long term, ketosis is not widely studied on long-term timeframes on larger populations. And from the research that I've seen, there's some evidence to indicate that long-term ketosis could be harmful to the body because of ketoacidosis and other factors of sustained. Because there's an argument to be made that, from an evolutionary point of view, that is just not how we evolved anyway. And I'm not going to commit an appeal to nature here, but I just don't think.
I think we did, though, man. Like, there's a lot of anthropological evidence, like the isotopic nitrogen data, where we looked at various levels of nitrogen in humans at the time. This was like 30, 40,000 up to, I think, million years ago.
There's a
we
huge
were apex
problem.
carnivores.
There's a
We were
huge
consuming
problem with
other
the
carnivores.
isotopic nitrogen studies, because basically what happens is, from memory, like like you caught catching me a bit off guard here, because I thought we were going to be discussing ethics. I wasn't prepared to dive instantly into the research from ketosis. So this is all just off the cuff from memory.
Oh, no worries, man.
But the nitrogen stuff is affected profoundly by the I can't remember the exact mechanism which affects it, but essentially what they did was they analyzed the nitrogen like isotope values of various animals, and then they were creating a picture to see how carnivorous they were because of the amount of protein consumption and all of the other stuff that goes into that. And I just remember seeing a slide and presentation from someone. I can probably pull it up if you give me a minute. That there's actually, if you look at the full spectrum of animals that they covered, you started to see that there was animals which are herbivorous, like demonstrably herbivorous, which had higher nitrogen isotope levels than the carnivorous animals. So humans were higher than like a lion or something. But then it was like a fucking antelope or some shit that was like even higher than human.
There are some plant foods that do have higher nitrogen. That is true, but most of the plant foods that do have higher nitrogen are the inedible leaves that humans can't tolerate. I remember there was a presentation that showed which specific foods were correlated with the higher nitrogen levels. And there's also various levels of nitrogen. There's like C10 and C12.
Yeah, the problem wasn't the dietary component of nitrogen. It was the fact that the preservation and the environmental factors which influenced that led to inaccurate representations of reality. Right? It just didn't point to anything of use. So there was a lot of carnivore, not carnivore, but keto, paleo people. This is more sort of in the paleo sort of era, about 15 years ago, 10 years ago, or whatever. That people were now like doing presentations and pointing to these nitrogen values, but it was just debunked to fuck because they were just very unreliable values because of the preservation, the environmental preservation, or like it just didn't make any sense. And I do apologize that I can't go into this in more detail because this is literally just from memory of stuff that I've seen like literally years ago now. From like Plant Positive went into this, and I saw a presentation from I can't remember who it was. Like I can't even remember who the presentation.
I've seen the refutes.
Was from.
I've watched a bunch of the refutes of it too. Like I try to listen to both sides, and like I've watched quite a few of the University of California anthropological lectures that talk about the isotopic carbon dating. And yeah, there were some plant foods that did have higher levels of nitrogen, but you would have to consume them in absolutely massive quantities in which that we don't have the rumen, the gut, or really any of the enzymes to break down those fibers to actually take full advantage. The entirety of our, like, there's C8, there's C10, and there's C12. And the higher nitrogen plant foods max out at C8. All of the top level carnivores were maxing out at C10 and C12. And then humans were also eating the other apex carnivores. And that's why we had such a deep concentration of that nitrogen isotopes, because it could only come from the insane and massive consumption of animal foods. In no way could it come from just the consumption of plant foods. It was like 90% of our diet was coming from animal foods. And I don't disagree. Like, we sought calories where we can get it. Like, we ate lots of starch. Like, once we discovered the ability to cook starch, that was a pretty large boost in our propagation rates and like how easily we're able to have children. The increase in carbohydrates just gave you more calories to support more kids, and that tied down the line. But the isotopic nitrogen data is pretty unequivocal from like Mickey Bendor. If you've ever listened to him, he's another anthropologist that has looked into this, and it could only have been driven by the massive consumption of plant foods. And if you look at all the other studies on human evolution, like, it was 100% driven by the consumption of meat and fat and really high omega-3 foods, like, that are high in EPA and DHA in phospholipid form. You could argue that maybe humans back in the day had better conversion metrics to where they could eat the ALA-rich plant foods and make more EPA and DHA, but nowadays there are studies on the ALA conversion rate. You can't convert ALA to DHA. You can to EPA, but not DHA. And there's no way that the consumption of plant foods could have driven our increase in physical stature, our increase in brain size, the social aspect of it. We can get into this little interesting gut peptide called cholecystokinin. It's only released when you eat meat and fat. It's a satiating hormone. It regulates it even regulates oxytocin, which is like a bonding hormone. So they think the evolution value of it was consuming meat with your tribe, the people that you helped hunt that animal with, would increase oxytocin levels and help support society through cooperation. So I don't know if you're arguing for the side that plant foods were the primary driver in human evolution, or if there's any value in appealing to our evolution to determine what we eat today. But I think if you look at epigenetics and nutrigenomics and looking at how genes propagate and how important fat-soluble vitamins are for proper gene regulation, and also just being in ketosis, I think, like I said, much of our modern disease is because we're in an evolutionary mismatch, and we are essentially causing dysgenics by consuming the wrong type of foods.
Yeah, so you just sort of put a whole bunch of different things on the table, and So like you bringing up epigenetics and the whole evolution, a whole bunch of things. Like we were just talking about the nitrogen isotope analysis. I'm trying to look here just off like spare a moment, just like looking through trying to trawl through to get some information up, but I just can't find the specific information right now.
Yeah, I have the study here if you want to check it out.
Yeah, no, the problem is that there's so much polarization surrounding this particular value, right? And because it's just been it's basically like been pointed to by the paleo community a few years ago as like definitive proof that humans come from a more carnivorous background, right? In a Paleolithic era, they were eating a lot of meat, right? And then it just got discredited, like just ridiculously, to the point where like anyone who brought that up was just laughed at, like after. But I can't find the debate on this just by searching nitrogen isotope analysis, herbivores, carnivores. I can't find it in just like 2 minutes, like just off the cuff. I'll need to dig
I linked
for
one
that
of them.
more. So, but
if you check out DC Test, I linked one of them.
Yeah, all I can say on that though is from what I know about that, what I've looked at, that's just been highly discredited. And you keep referring back to saying, oh, well, it would be about the plant foods. They would have to consume an enormous amount of this specific type of leaves or whatever.
Yeah,
no,
an edible amount, like pounds a day of it.
Yeah, exactly. But the problem was, it was as far as I can remember, as I'm saying, this is just off the top of my head from a couple of years back looking into this stuff, that it was actually an inaccurate value because of the environmental influences over the course of the preservation of the isotopes, right? So it was like there was degradation in, or there was some reason why the validity was called into question, whether it was even a reliable indication of what they were searching for in the first place. So even before you say, oh, well, it could have been influenced, it would have been influenced by these dietary factors, and you'd have to consume an inedible amount of foliage. Well, even before you get to that stage, it was discredited.
But I've looked at the discredits. Like I said, I watched a couple of the University of California attempts at discrediting it, and it was a pretty interesting. Like they had 3 different speakers come up. Like the initial speaker came up and explained like how certain plant foods can contribute that higher level of nitrogen in bones and collagen tissue. But the other researcher came up and explained that the sheer number of those plant foods that you'd have to consume to replace that level of nitrogen in your bones and in your collagen would be completely impossible. Like you'd have to eat literally like several pounds of the foliage every day consistently, and there's no evidence of that. There's really no evidence of it, so I don't know how it's debunked.
Yeah, again, you seem to be falling back on this idea that you're basically begging the question by granting the validity to the data, the type of data collection, which I'm saying, not the findings of the data that it would have been influenced by diet, but the actual analysis itself was a faulty process, which is what I'm saying. And as I say, I thought we were going to debate ethics. I wasn't prepared to launch into a super technical study bashing debate like on isotope dating in Paleolithic eras. Like we could do that at a later date, but like right now, I'm sort of a bit unprepared to present any actual solid information on that. So I can only just go off of what I know off the top of my head. And I'm just saying that is an important part of your case from an evolutionary point of view, that we were to consume a lot of, we have in Paleolithic era consumed a lot of meat, but it just doesn't seem to be the case based on what I've seen. And you're using the nitrogen isotope
that's part of it. I have another argument too, that you might be a little bit more
I'm not compelled by that. So I think that we should, I'm just going to put my hands up and say I can't compellingly refute that right now this second, but I can come back at a later date and refute that, but I just can't do it off the cuff right now. So,
Yeah, we can discuss
are you willing
ethics
to
a bit
put
later.
that aside?
Yeah, but let me add another point. So here's an interesting timeline that I think has a lot of value and a lot of implication that I think is commonly overlooked, and there have been studies on this. But have you looked at the time frame of the agricultural revolution and its impact on human brain size and stature and overall bone density and development? Have you read into that at all?
Yeah, like the thing is, all of this, a lot of people come up with very definite things that they can point to and say, look, at this precise era, this precise thing happened, and it was because of this precise cause. But when you actually look at it and actually see what the researchers are actually saying, no one actually has this 100% foolproof explanation and answer, because it was so long ago. We can only make very broad inductive claims based upon like a broad variety of snippets of information, right? So no one can pinpoint that 100,000 years ago X happened and this led to that, right? We can only hypothesize, and there's conflicting hypotheses as to what exactly happened. Now, one of those hypotheses, which I find compelling, is that we were able to organize we were able to organize the foraging of starch calories, and starch led to the formation of bigger brains, and there's experts who support that hypothesis. But then you've got people on the other side saying, oh no, that's complete bullshit because you've got this and that. And where I'm not a paleontologist, and like I don't, as I say, I'm unprepared for this conversation right now on specific claims from the Paleolithic era. I don't have any. I'm just sitting in my fucking living room on my phone. So
yeah. I thought we kind of. I mean, I assumed that we all knew that this was going to be about nutrition. I didn't know if SD talked to you or.
I thought it was about ethics.
I was gonna. Yeah, my goal is to talk about just health in general. I mean, the ethics thing we can talk about a little bit later. I mean, my ethic argument is pretty simple. I think humans are facultative carnivores, and it's unethical to starve yourself and damage your future progeny and really the sum total of the human race if everyone's following that diet. I think that's unethical just for a plethora of reasons. You're sacrificing yourself for the animals, essentially.
Okay, right. So you've made a bunch of claims. We've talked a bit about some technical stuff, and what I'd say is, for now, because we're not really going to get anywhere if you post a bunch of stuff in the chat and I'm just going to be like, oh yeah, from my point of view, I've seen this thing and that thing, and like this isn't very persuasive for either side. So what I'd like to do is just let's just be a bit more common sense. Let's boil this down, distill this down. Let's for a minute put all of these tiny fragments of confusing technical mechanistic data and pieces of the puzzle aside, and let's just look at the broader picture. Let's just step back and have a look at the broader picture. So firstly, you think that not including animal foods as a significant portion of your diet is going to lead to deficiencies. You just said that I would not be able to procreate, like something would happen to my offspring, or there'd be some issue of malnutrition. Well, I've been vegan for approaching the decade, and I personally am doing absolutely fine. One of my good friends has been vegan for about 25 years, is doing absolutely fine. And you can find many examples of people who've eaten exclusively plants for 50 years or more. And then you can just look at people who have eaten a carnivorous diet for a few years, or I don't know what the longest carnivorous eater is in years. But both sides are going to say, look, it seems to work for us. What we know doesn't necessarily seem to work is consuming a diet of Dr. Pepper and Pop-Tarts. And you said that you came from a background of eating a diet of Dr. Pepper and Pop-Tarts. And so if that's the type of carbohydrate that you're referring to when you're saying that carbohydrate is causing diabetes and insulin problems and potentially cancer and all these other things, I agree. Like, we agree with each other 100%. this is one thing that we can wholeheartedly stand together on and say, look, we agree that a diet of Dr. Pepper and Pop-Tarts isn't going to be good. But making the claim that I'm unhealthy because I don't eat meat, right? Like you're just asserting that I'm unhealthy, and if I was just to eat animal products, I'd be healthy. Well, I'll tell you, I have eaten animal products. In last time was September last year. I accidentally ate animal products. I accidentally ate feta cheese, which is made from sheep's milk, and I had violent digestive reaction to that. Like I was squirting shit projectile fashion out of my ass and running to the toilet for a couple of days.
Yeah,
so,
I've been there too, man. I've actually been there recently with a raw blue sheep cheese. That fucked me up.
Yeah, so
I think it's specific to the person.
So if you're going to claim that animal products will stop, are going to be good for me, or obviously they're not. So now we need to be a bit more specific. So you're going to say if I eat beef, that I'm going to experience some radical health transformation, or what would happen if I ate a steak right now?
Yeah, and that's what I advocate for. So if you ate yourself a very rare steak, so we can get into the taurine argument if you've ever read into taurine, but it was another one of the principal amino acids that drove the evolution of the human prefrontal cortex and self-awareness. There's studies on taurine, the amino acid, being responsible for a bunch of upregulation in like neurodevelopmental genes that increase the neuron density in the prefrontal hippocampus or the prefrontal cortex. But in terms of testing it, and this is what I try to get every vegan to do, because I think that there are obvious sensitivities that certain people may have to dairy. Like I even know a couple of carnivore people who can't tolerate raw milk of any sort or any dairy of any sort. I think it's widely variable depending on genetics, depending on how the food was prepared, depending on how the cheese was prepared. I don't advocate for eating any sort of pasteurized dairy milk product of any kind. There's really a fundamental damaging of its tolerability, the digestibility, how the lactose is digested when you heat the milk over 120, 130 degrees. So your reaction to that feta cheese, I think, was not necessarily a reaction to an animal food. I think it was a reaction to a pasteurized, fundamentally poisonous food that is not really intended for human consumption. I don't think we should be eating pasteurized dairy.
Well, just to respond to the pasteurization of dairy, the reason why dairy is pasteurized is because the health dangers of consuming raw milk. Now, you might be anecdotally
I have statistics on that. Yeah, I have statistics on that. Right, we can talk more about it, but go ahead.
Yeah, various people have got various different conflicting sets of statistics on that. But the government statistics, and the reason why the government mandated the law for commercial milk production had to be passed.
It was not for safety. It was not for safety, man. I can give you the full timeline. It was purely for cost, more or less. And what the whole timeline of how it happened is pretty suspect. If you look into the timeline in which the pasteurization process was implemented, the entire initial reaction that people were having to raw milk was precipitated by them feeding distillery runoff and like some other chemical runoff process from the processing of beer. So they started feeding all these cattle really a bunch of food that they're not intended to eat that was massively toxic to their health, and it ended up making the milk consequentially dangerous and high in pathogens and low in lactoferrin and lactoperoxidase, which did kill people. It was the way in which they were feeding the cattle. It's not the raw milk itself. It's what they feed the cattle. If you look at the statistics on raw milk from quality grass-fed cows that are properly taken care of, it's actually one of the safest foods you can eat. If you look at the statistics on which people get pathogens and other infections from food, the highest foods are green vegetables. They're fruits and green vegetables. And then I think eggs are next, and then meat and like pork and chicken. And at the very bottom, it's dairy. Dairy is a very, very safe food.
Yeah, no, I think you might be conflating statistics, right? Because the safety, the safety of milk is increased significantly with pasteurization, and raw milk.
Nope.
You
not
seem
true
to
either,
be
man.
asserting ad hoc sort of conspiracy theories about the production of milk, right? The government, if there was a certain specific case of contamination, then that would be targeted at a local level, right? So the government aren't just going to mandate an international level just because of some. You initially said because of cost, because of cost. So let's say that I decide to sell carrots and I produce these carrots in a way which is economically inefficient, and so my carrots cost €100 per carrot. Is the government gonna enact some legislation against me to reduce the cost of my carrot? No. When has that happened? Like I think that that's such an ad hoc.
No, you're missing the point. So when I said it was cost, it's because they did not. At that time, it became a really politically divisive issue, and I think the dairy industry more or less took advantage of it because they knew that if you had to require a pasteurization process, farmers could essentially no longer sell milk directly to the consumer. There was no more middleman. It moved from selling directly to the consumer.
I can pasteurize milk in my kitchen.
No, that's the thing, is that the regulations that came out at the time, they instituted that all milk, nearly all milk, and some states have rescinded this. I know raw milk's legal in California now. It's legal in South Carolina. In most states, you can get it as long as you bring your own container to a farmer. There are a couple of states that have made it just outright illegal, and even Canada has made it outright legal. But in terms of the statistical validity of why they did that, it's not fair in the context that if eating lettuce is going to give me a higher risk of getting E. coli and a pathogen, why isn't lettuce made illegal in every state? Why specifically was raw milk targeted?
You're conflating statistics. So lettuce, firstly, the reason why lettuce gives you E. coli is because of contamination with animal bacteria, but that's another issue.
No, it's because slaves farm those foods. Because if you look at where we get most of our green veggies from and the lettuce from, it's from Mexico and a couple other South American countries, and it's because the people are basically forced to work in the fields all day and they shit in the fields. Most of the infections come from people shitting in the fields, not from animal fertilizer or animal manure used to grow the plant. It's from the people shitting in the fields.
That is just factually incorrect. So that's borderline fucking I don't know, that's like discriminatory. It's a bit on PC. I don't like that a lot. That it sounds very ad hoc and not very grounded in science, man. That is.
I didn't link you the details on it. I just linked the CDC foodborne illness statistics.
Is it from the Daily Stormer by any chance? And are they?
No, it's from the CDC. It's from the CDC.
From the CDC, they're saying that the reason for this outbreak, the reason for international outbreaks of E. coli, is because Mexicans shitting on your lettuce.
No, I'm saying the principal cause of most infections, most of the E. coli infections that come from lettuce are human sourced fecal matter. It's not from the fertilizer or the animal stool. It's from human sourced E. coli.
So you're saying,
and I said that's on the CDC website. If you look it up, they say the principal cause of infection is from
can you link me that? That sounds bizarre. That even just the quantity of human fecal matter that would be. Like they spread it around on the lettuce. It's
honestly it's because they live in slave conditions and they don't give the workers who are working in the fields gathering the plant foods a proper break, and they shit in the field. And then sometimes it gets on the lettuce or into the lettuce, and it's subsequently.
This is genuinely the first time I've heard of that. Like I've actually looked into this before and came to the conclusion from my research that was because of animal. Bacteria.
Yeah, cattle do contribute. I mean, cattle, I'm not saying they don't contribute to infection rates in some of it based on the manure, but there's another argument that's really important, is that the manure that they're using to put on those plant crops is usually manure from grain-fed sick cows. Like if you're feeding cows a bunch of GMO, like gnarly Frankenstein food that does God knows what to the digestive system, is packed full of pesticides and other antibacterials, it's going to make superbugs that exist in the fecal matter of that animal, which then used to process and help a crop grow is going to have some risk of giving people infections. But I'll have to find I can't remember which strain. I know it's like a coli 0157, I think, is only found in human intestines, not in animals.
Well, can you point to that specific, you link the CDC, right? website about foodborne illnesses, that's fine. But you can't just link, like, what am I supposed to do right now on the spot this very second? Look through all of this, look at all of the links, look through all of the data and verify your claim. Can you actually link to the specific part of this where it contributes E. coli outbreaks of lettuce around the world to Mexicans shitting on the crop?
Yeah, well, it was it was from the CDC website saying what is the principal cause of the foodborne illness in produce.
Can you link to the specific part? That there's so much information here. There's not only the article itself, which is moderately long. You've also got you've got an 8 megabyte, nearly 9 megabyte PDF. You've got images here, figure A, figure B, figure C, figure D, figure E. Can you be a bit more charitable and just don't dump that on me, but actually point to where it said that?
Let me find it.
Cool, man. And can you also clarify that you're not conflating the safety statistics of pasteurized milk with raw milk, because the statistics that I've seen on raw milk are worrying?
Yeah, let me get the presentation for you. I'm going to link the screenshots of these studies and the references in chat. Or in VC Tech. Is there a megabyte limit on this server? Like, what's the max presentation size I can link?
SD,
uploads maximum 8 megabytes unless you have Nitro.
Fuck. Okay, hang on. I have to shave a bunch of slides off this for it to be uploaded, so give me a second.
Okay, so I'll just read your study. I've just pasted a study in VC Text, which is a systematic review and meta-analysis of the effects of pasteurization on milk. So the claim that you said that the nutritive status of milk is demolished by the pasteurization process is considered factually incorrect based upon this meta-analysis.
Do you know they measure pasteurization? So the way they measure if a milk is pasteurized is by the level of phosphatase, the phosphatase enzyme in the milk. And losing that enzyme is principally important for calcium metabolism. If you don't have the phosphatase enzyme in the milk, the calcium is not absorbed like it's supposed to and transported into bones. It's absorbed systemically and peripherally into other organs. And that's why I agree the pasteurized dairy is not a food that we should be consuming, because the calcium ends up peripherally in organ tissue, There's been studies on on dairy being implicated in prostate cancer, breast cancer, principally from the lack of the phosphatase enzyme. And I've seen those studies, and if you look at some of the research contributors to that, it's usually dairy industry. Those studies are very misleading and disingenuous, saying that there's no difference in the quality or the digestibility of pasteurized versus raw. I can give you 1,000 different anecdotes from me personally and other people. If I consume pasteurized dairy, I shit foam and I feel like death for quite a bit of time, and raw milk does not give me that problem. There is a fundamental mechanism in that.
Well, if we're going to go off science, I just gave you a systematic review and meta-analysis. But if you reject that on the basis of anecdote, then that's fine. We'll just leave that point then.
No, I'll link you another study. Hang on.
If you're gonna reject a systematic review in favor of personal anecdote, then I don't think we can argue that point compellingly.
Well, that's the thing, is that there's other studies that show a massive difference in the quality and the absorption and fundamental assimilation of nutrients from raw milk compared to pasteurized.
Do you have something as high up on the evidence hierarchy as a meta-analysis or systematic review?
I don't subscribe to the evidence hierarchy. And I can link you a study that thoroughly debunks our various, why we value certain studies over others and why we value meta-analysis, which really just includes a bunch of other low-quality studies, calls it a meta-analysis or some quality study, and says that it's more valuable. Like, mechanistic data, I think, is just as valuable. There are case reports that can be just as valuable. It's the whole picture. It's not just a single meta-analysis study that goes, "Oh, this is all debunked. We agree that pasteurization makes a difference."
I'm not trying to argue the case that one single meta-analysis rules the scientific literature as the sole authoritative source of information on a particular topic, because there are meta-analyses which I can point to which are fallacious in their conclusions, and I can point out exactly what they did wrong. And then other meta-analyses come along and they correct that. But if you're gonna, but you're not making the claim that mechanistic data is more important than like a cohort study, right? Are you?
I think it depends. Depends on what studies the cohort study or the meta-analysis include. I mean, the meta-analysis can be, like the meta-analysis that they did on the consumption of meat causing bowel cancer, there was like 140 studies in that meta-analysis, and they eliminated 132 of them and left with only 8 studies that had small correlations with the increase in cancer from consuming meat. So I think there's a lot of disingenuous behavior and cherry picking that can happen in meta-analysis or even cohort studies, and they can be intentionally misleading. And that's why I just linked my other side, my meta-analysis that looks at the varying rates of cancer and vitamin concentrations and just fundamental absorption and nutrient assimilation, the difference between raw milk and pasteurized. And like I said, there's studies that show just standard pasteurized milk consumption is associated with cancer, bowel cancer, prostate cancer, breast cancer, but those same associations are not found with raw milk. The mechanism of that is because when you pasteurize milk, it loses the phosphatase enzyme, which makes it so you can't properly absorb and assimilate calcium.
Okay, wait. Let's go one at a time. The meta-analysis that you just linked me says, overall, these findings should be interpreted with caution given the poor quality of the reported methodology in many of the included studies. So that's not something...
that's referencing pasteurized milk.
Yeah, that's not something that I would consider authoritative when it's basically saying, yeah, don't watch this, it's garbage. I mean, like, the study itself is saying that, like... you know what I mean?
Well, I mean, the thing too is, like, we have correlation data. I mean, there's no large scale study, but we have correlation data on increases in allergy and autoimmune disease upon the advent of pasteurized milk. I mean, we've been consuming raw milk from cow. I mean, if you're Eastern European, if you're a white guy, most of your lineage was built on the consumption of raw dairy products, of cheese, kefir, yogurt, raw milk, and we didn't have any problems with it prior. There was no massive rates of people getting infections from raw milk. It wasn't until we started feeding cattle the wrong food.
Yeah, hold on. What about lactose intolerance, which is rife in society?
Yeah, and that's another point that a lot of people point to, saying that just because there's lactose in the food, that means you're intolerant to it. But this is another point of why pasteurization is bad. When you heat milk above 115 degrees, all the lactobacilli bacteria dies. Every bit of it dies, and that is the principle. That is really the only way that you're going to be able to fundamentally digest that lactose. And then you look at the fermentation arguments. Most of the milk that we were consuming was more than likely fermented. I mean, we didn't have refrigerators. We didn't have ways to preserve the milk. So as soon as we milked the cow, we let it sit out at room temperature for a day and clabber into fermented milk, which had no lactose. When you ferment milk, it loses all the lactose, making it much more digestible. And I mean, I can point to Rosie. She doesn't drink milk, but she eats cheese and has no problem with it because the lactose in milk bothers her. So I'm not arguing that people don't have lactose intolerance. I think most Asian people are intolerant to lactose, but I think the rates in which people are lactose intolerant is entirely determined with pasteurized milk, not raw milk. There's a huge difference in the digestibility, the quality, and the way in which you assimilate nutrients from raw milk than with pasteurized.
Yeah, that for me, I'm currently just on the spot going through a few study. I've got I'm looking at a study here on raw unpasteurized milk, but I find what you're doing and what many raw milk advocates do, the same as any sort of like it's similar with anti-vaxxers and similar with many people.
Come on, don't equate me with that.
They'll say like some evangelical sort of like magical status that is raw, so therefore it's good. Or it will say, oh, well, the pasteurization process, it deactivates or denatures this enzyme or that other enzyme. It was like, well,
yeah,
or the
there's
enzymes
evidence
are
of that,
denatured
man.
in your stomach anyway. The enzymes are denatured by the hydrochloric acid in your stomach. So they're deactivated anyway. So
Not true. Not true either.
How's that? How is it not?
It again depends widely. It is pretty variable between people. There are certain populations that are not tolerant to milk because none of their evolutionary history consumed it. And there's, again, varying degrees of severity that people can have in reactions to those foods. But if you look at what constitutes raw milk and why it's so much of a better food than pasteurized milk, go take a look at the presentation I just linked in the chat. There are probably, I mean, the principal reason why raw milk is a lot more beneficial is it contains like sphingolipids and fatty acids that help protect the enzymes and help utilize them throughout digestion. Some enzymes can be broken down in stomach acid, but not all. There are quite a few enzymes that persist through stomach acid and assist with digestion. And it's the same thing for lactobacilli. Like lactobacilli bacteria is extremely acid resistant. I mean, when you ferment milk, it ends up having a pretty low pH. I think it's like 2 pH or like 1.8 or 2 pH, which means it can survive stomach acid and assist with the digestion of the food. But if you take a look at that presentation I linked to, there is just a massive amount of nutrients and immunological factors and like leukocytes, like macrophages, all these things that are really important for the digestion of the milk. And when you pasteurize it, you lose much of that. You lose a portion of some of the vitamins, some of the immunological components. Other ones, you lose the entirety of it. Really, yeah, I'm just arguing that if you're going to consume dairy, it has to be raw. You should not consume pasteurized dairy.
I've got two problems here. So basically everything, not everything, but a lot of things that you're linking here are like slides from obviously some like raw milk advocates presentation.
Yeah,
and so
studies are linked though.
Yeah, but you just got like a bunch of slides, and like I could just make a slide and put links like on it, but it doesn't necessarily mean that if I went ahead, read those studies, that A, they were high quality studies, B, the studies actually say what I'm suggesting they say. And like, do you know what I mean? It's just posting someone's slide. This isn't a great form of evidence. And if you're just like spamming me loads of slides, I can't really keep up with this. And for example, this one slide that you posted has got 5 links in it. And what do you expect me just to look through all of that right now? Let's go step by step and break.
I mean,
down
if you're making points, I'm trying to make points and provide evidence. I mean, you asked for evidence, so
yeah, sure. I require evidence, but if I'm sort of getting inundated with slides with millions of links everywhere, and I'm trying to go systematically step by step.
We can take
through
a
this.
sec. I'm not trying to rush you.
So firstly, I just want to reference. I posted a link in the chat. It's on the Internet Archive. I was just going through trying to look at the pre-pasteurization deaths attributable to raw milk consumption. And they say in this article that that they estimate that at least milk pasteurization prevented at least 25,000 deaths per year just in the United States following World War II from bovine tuberculosis, right, which was a huge problem back in the day.
And I can give you studies on what was causing the bovine tuberculosis. When you feed an animal if you feed an animal a diet that's not native to, if the cows that you're getting raw milk from are being solely fed like corn and grains and no grass, yes, you're going to have much higher incidence of illness, which is, I mean, milk is essentially white blood, really. Like, it's blood without the heme and the red blood cells. It's whatever the cow eats, whatever the cow is consuming determines the nutritional quality and the safety of the food. And I don't disagree that a lot of people were getting sick from raw milk back when we were starting to feed them all these distillery runoff byproducts and all the Frankenstein grains. Like, these are foods you're not supposed to be feeding cows. And if you drink milk from a cow that is being fed a unnatural diet, a diet not native to its evolution, then yeah, you're going to get sick from it more likely than not. But if you look at the statistics on properly raised grass-fed raw milk, it's one of the safest foods there is statistically. Like, so many people across the country, so many farmers consume raw milk every day, and none of them get sick. And if you look at the presentation I linked to you, there's all these really neat built-in defense systems that raw milk has, and they've tested this with E. coli. If lactoperoxidase and lactoferrin, which are very, very strong antibacterials, if those persist in the milk, E. coli cannot grow. It just can't. Even Campylobacter, even Salmonella, those bacteria cannot grow in raw milk with active levels of lactoferrin and lactoperoxidase. If you pasteurize the milk, reduce the levels of both those enzymes, and then get some sort of pathogen in the milk, it's going to proliferate. And that's why there are higher rates of people getting sick from pasteurized milk than with raw milk. And you can say that they link saying that the total amount of deaths were reduced from the consumption of raw milk. Yeah, that was true in the context of feeding an animal a diet not native to its evolution, feeding an animal a diet that's not rich in grass. So essentially you're drinking unhealthy cow milk that's going to make you sick. And I don't disagree with that.
Okay, so what you're saying now is basically it's an argument from the quality of the milk, and I'm not.
Yeah, same thing with meat.
I don't think we should eat grain-fed meat either. It's a bit subjective. It's a bit subjective saying, "Oh, high quality milk," and then the farmer's going to be like, "Oh, wow, milk is of the highest quality. I assure you that." So
we've known this forever, man. Like, that's why I talk about nutrition and physical degeneration. The Swiss and the Low Chantal Valley knew specifically that if they were going to consume their milk and make cheese out of it to persist through the winter, the cows had to be on grass. They could not feed them anything other than grass. Otherwise, the nutrient quality of milk is reduced, has less fat-soluble vitamins, has much less omega-3s, has reduced lactobacilli content. Like, the diet of the animal is principally important in the quality of the meat. I mean, you are what you eat on a fundamental level, on a very deep level. You are what you eat. And it's the same thing for meat. I don't think you should consume grain-fed meat where the cattle were eating grains that were sprayed with glyphosate and atrazine and other pesticides, which ends up in the fat of the animal, and then you consume it. I think there's extreme importance in the quality of the animal's feed in determining the nutritional quality and the safety of it. Huge importance.
Okay, so I'm just reading statistics on raw versus pasteurized milk, and apparently there was between 1998, they looked between 1998 and 2008, and they found 1,614 reported illnesses from raw milk, 187 hospitalizations and 2 deaths. Which isn't a lot, but the thing is they go on to say that since many millions of people drink pasteurized milk every day in the United States, and only about 1% to 3% of the population drinks raw milk, the number of illnesses reported show that the actual risk of getting sick from drinking raw milk is tremendously higher than drinking pasteurized milk. So if we look at absolute numbers, we can see that less people get sick from drinking raw milk. But if we look at relative numbers, we can see that way more proportionally people get sick from.
Right, and here's where you have to question where they get the statistics from on raw milk. If someone, and this is what happens with most of the statistics, someone will come into the hospital, they'll get a food questionnaire, what they ate recently, and they have some sort of digestive issue. They'll get a food questionnaire saying, what did you eat? They'll say, if they say raw milk, it's immediately assumed that that was the principal cause of the infection, with zero testing of their microbiome to see what pathogen was present, zero testing of the milk that they got their supposed pathogen from. It's all inference. There really is almost no evidence correlating a raw milk source with an outbreak. There have been some cases of brucellosis being implicated with raw milk, but they've also found that it's the cows that have gotten brucellosis vaccines, and the vaccine shedding ends up in the milk and then can consequentially infect humans. But in terms of the native risk of raw milk, there's really no evidence of it coming directly from raw milk. Those sicknesses coming directly from raw milk. It's assumed sickness. It's not actual confirmed, tested pathogens in the raw milk. It's an assumed thing.
Okay, well, I'm not convinced that raw milk is totally safe, and but I don't really need to be, because I don't really see any reason that I should be consuming milk anyway when I'm intolerant to consuming milk.
Have you ever tried raw? Have you ever tried raw cream?
Let me finish. You're asserting that if I try raw milk, I won't be intolerant to the lactose in the milk. But this just seems like, for me, even if that was the case, there is still no reason why I would value consuming milk over consuming something else which has a lower risk of disease-causing factors.
I mean, that's what I'm saying. Like, have you ever tried any raw cheese? Any raw dairy?
Yeah, I have. And I tried some raw. I think it was goat. It was definitely goat cheese, raw goat cheese, from like the artisan organic place in Berlin. This was in Berlin in about 2010, I think. So almost 10, I've not been vegan for 10 years. I've been vegan for almost 10 years. And, pretty ill after eating that. But that was quite a long time ago. So, I'm not gonna.
Yeah. And I mean, here's another thing too. I mean, goat milk is also pretty high in lactoperoxidase, which is a strong antibacterial. And I think most of the lactose intolerance, most of the negative reactions that people have to raw milk is from gut bacteria dying from those antibacterial factors and those reculturing factors. And I don't know if you've read anything about the microbiome and how lipopolysaccharide works, but if bacteria dies in your gut, it releases an incredibly inflammatory endotoxin called lipopolysaccharide, which can be correlated with diarrhea, symptoms of food poisoning, like all kinds of other symptoms. So I think it's a lot more complicated than people just being innately allergic to milk. I think it varies widely, and people with certain gut dysbiosis or a gut that's not equipped to, or does not have a microbiome equipped to handle that dairy, you can have weird side effects initially, but I think if you continue to consume it becomes much less damaging.
I just don't know why I'd consume these foods, and if you're even saying that it contains this harmful constituent which is going to kill my gut bacteria and give me this horrible side effect, then that's not a very good argument for consuming. But if you're saying no, not goats.
Well, what if it's a beneficial thing? Like, what if those pathogens dying is like, I mean, you first have to go through the pathogens dying off and then dealing with the subsequent inflammation from the LPS.
I just think we're descending. I just think we're descending into like really specific.
Okay, yeah, we can get away from the raw milk.
You guys have been going for a little over an hour now. Do you maybe want to shift it into ethics or environment or something like that for a little bit?
Yeah, sure. I feel like
I feel like we're getting sort of caught up in extremely like zoomed in microscopic details of this specific amino acid and this specific constituent of this specific food is going to do this, and I feel like we need to have a look at a broader picture.
I mean, the truth is in the details.
Yeah, no, but the confusion and obfuscation is also in the details. And I think that you're doing a lot of this obfuscating of trying to appeal to specific amino acids or specific this or specific that, and missing the fact that the general consensus in the scientific literature shows us that a diet comprised of more fruits and vegetables is better for life expectancy. And remember as well, at the end of the day, look, remember the baseline sort of like health outcome in terms of like the life expectancy in a developed country, let's say like Canada or the United States or Britain or Germany or France, for example, is like somewhere in the region of 80 plus years. So that's the average life expectancy. In the Paleolithic era or whatever, it was like fucking 30, 40 or however old.
That's infant mortality. That's not lifespan. That's infant mortality factoring in.
Yeah, but even when you control for infant mortality, you've still got an extremely short lifespan compared to the modern. If you're just gonna refute that and say that like
I have a study for
people lived like in excess of 80 years on average, then I just think the conversation is getting silly.
So here's the other thing: the metrics where they try to determine the lifespan that's pre-10. That's not pre-10,000 years or 10,000 years ago. The actual lifespans of early hunter-gatherers before the agricultural revolution or the mass consumption of plant foods, we had really high infant mortality. We had also high rates of infection, getting eaten by lions and other shit that factor into that. But the main point is that hunter-gatherers still had the same length of lifespan that we had if they lived to be that age without getting sick or getting killed or eaten or whatever the other natural context was. The argument saying that just because hunter-gatherers did a certain thing, their lifespan was only 30, 40 years old, is disingenuous because they're not factoring in the other external factors or environmental factors that reduce their lifespan. In terms of how long we've always lived, like there's evidence of plenty of populations having people living to be 90, 100 years old consistently.
Yeah, sure. And if you look at the blue zones and parts of the world where they predominantly diet comprised of carbohydrates and fruits and vegetables, and you see that they are the areas leading in the longevity. And if you look at the Inuits or populations which consumed a high amount of animal foods, despite Western aid prior to this dentist 100 years ago almost going around, like despite a dentist's book, the Inuits were actually dying of heart disease, or they had signs of heart disease
after westernized foods, not their native diet.
No,
when they were consuming their native diet.
No, there's evidence to support the native diet, and actually there's evidence to support that when I've actually got some data. I don't have it in front of me now. I can probably find it though. That when the native Inuits switched from their diet of seal blubber and eating like the moss out of the stomach of animals to prevent them from being in ketosis, which was actually a thing as well. But when they switched from their horrendous diet of whale blubber, etc., to eating a diet of like standard American diet junk food, including Twinkies and everything else that goes with the standard American diet, they actually increased their longevity. So their diet of animal products was so awful that they actually improved their health by eating junk food.
I know what you're referring to, and I've seen the refutation of this. Is before they were introduced to westernized foods, like they were consuming more grains that they had accessible because of westernized foods. Eating their native diet, which was principally like they ate berries throughout the season, like they ate certain plant foods. Like I think they soaked acorns too and had like a certain preparation process. I don't know if it was acorns or some other nut. But the principal larger portion of their diet was like raw meat and high amounts of fat. And prior to the westernized foods coming in, they had a pretty long lifespan. I mean, if you've there's a book called Not by Bread Alone, or The Fat of the Land by Vjalmar Stephenson. He was a guy that went and lived with them, and he was able to study them for years, and he had the same observations that the Inuit had very long lifespans, great health, great teeth, like no cancer, no disease, and they were consuming principally just meat and fat in excess. And it wasn't until they were introduced to
this
westernized foods that
this contradicts directly the mummified remains that they analysed of Native Canadian Inuits or Greenland Inuits. I don't know if that's Greenland or Canada or whatever. But yeah, they had mummified remains, and they found that they had atherosclerotic plaque, like severe, and they found that they also had various other horrendous osteoporosis and horrendous conditions, which
but did you look at their teeth?
And these other people weren't really picking up on.
They looked at their teeth, though. That's another thing, is when they looked at their teeth, they had massive amounts of cavities and dental issues, which implies that they were consuming too many carbohydrates.
No, wait. Weston A. Price said that they didn't.
No, wasn't Weston A. Price. This is what they looked at in the mummified. I think it was the Galactisoc.
Well, so they looked at mummified remains of 100-year-old like Inuits, and they found that they were consuming Twinkies.
Right, and I'm saying within the past 10,000 years, this is when we've had access to modern agriculture, and there's plenty of studies on the periodontal disease, and it, like I said, with the advent of agriculture 10,000 years ago, that's when we started seeing massive incidents of dental disease, of people's teeth being worn down, of massive amount of cavities and bone density loss.
So you're saying that
the Inuits were consuming too many plant foods.
So the Inuit remains in like Greenland / isolated Canada. The reason why they had atherosclerotic plaque in their arteries and various other health conditions and died at like the age of 45 or whatever, 50, the reason for that is because of all the sugar cane and the sweet potatoes that they were getting in Greenland. Is that what you're saying now?
Yeah, it's because, again, I'm arguing that you're not supposed to be consuming plant foods for 12 months out of the year, especially excessive amounts of carbs or starches.
So hundreds of years ago, Inuits had access to sweet potatoes and sugar cane.
No, I'm saying that they had access to westernized foods. I mean, this has been something that's been available for the past couple hundred years now that we've had transportation and the ability to trade goods between countries. They had access to a widely different diet than what their native evolution called for. And that's why I bring back to the Vjalmar Steffensen book. He observed this. The Inuit populations that stayed to their native diet, eating fuck tons of fat, fuck tons of animal foods, and only consuming berries and other plant foods intermittently when they were available in season, they had great health. They had no dental decay. They had no atherosclerosis. They were in fantastic health. It isn't until the introduction of consistent carbohydrates, not taking advantage of ketogenic metabolism, not getting enough fat-soluble vitamins, it's not until then where you see incidents of the atherosclerosis and periodontal disease and all that.
Well, look, if they've got remains of Inuits from hundreds of years ago, right, that they've analysed, and they've come to the conclusion that they had atherosclerotic plaque and a whole bunch of stuff. And then you're saying, oh no, but I read this book with this guy who went over and they were like, oh no, they're all cool. I don't know. I'd rather trust.
It's very selective. Literature. Well, it is. I mean, Vjalmar did a bunch of really in-depth research on these people. And this is why that's why I feel like we always have to get back to what is the principal diet that we're supposed to be eating. And it's not just the Inuit. Like, this has been observed among many cultures throughout history. And like I said, the isotopic carbon dating, the remains of hunter-gatherers compared to farmers after the agricultural revolution, it's really blatantly obvious that the advent of the mass consumption of plant foods has been the downfall of the human race in a lot of different contexts, but also the upheaval by giving us access to consistent calories, allowing us to propagate more and spend more time researching and getting involved in science. So like we were talking about initially with the evolutionary argument, the timeline is pretty definitive. We were on an apex of human growth for millions of years. Our brain size was increasing, our physical stature was increasing. All the evidence of the hunter-gatherers that were following a more meat-based, evolutionary-based diet, they had great health. They had longer lifespans. They didn't have any periodontal disease. They had much better teeth, bone density. They were bigger in size. And then at the agricultural revolution 10,000 years ago, when we were able to cultivate wheat and other plant foods, that is when you started to see decreases in human brain size. We lost like 10% of our total brain size. We lost like 25% of our physical stature. There is problems with bone density from deficiencies in fat-soluble vitamins like vitamin A and D.
You're really just reeling off a list of speculation and conjecture.
No,
based
I've
on
linked these, man.
reasons, right? Look, man, this
I'll link them again.
Like this is what annoys me. What annoys me in these kind of debates is it's basically just like a Gip Gallishing fest, where you're just like going over like a huge amount of ground, just saying, oh, this and that and that and that and that and this happened and that happened. It's like, how do you know all this? It's at best like radical speculation, and the world-leading experts don't know these things. You're just stating all of this as fact, and Gip Gallishing with a million different things, and just like linking slides and like random like news article, like you just linked a news article, and man, like it's difficult. It's difficult debating someone who you've obviously got an ideological bias and you're passionate about your position. But I'm trying to honestly debate this, but you just Gip Gallish with a bunch of stuff. It's too difficult to say, hold on, let's analyze that claim, and then you're just not going to be able to provide evidence of that.
Well, I'm linking evidence if you want to check VC chat.
Well, so what evidence are you going to provide now?
Yeah, I just linked it. The advent of farming was the principal cause for decreasing brain size.
Brains. Okay, so this is an article, not a study. Can you link a study, please?
No, it's about a study at Britain's Royal Society by Dr. Martyr Lair at Cambridge University, who studied the human fossil evidence for the past couple 100,000 years and looked at our stature and our brain size and correlated the decrease in stature and brain size. And there's also other studies on the bicameral mind. There's a study by the Lancet that correlates these consumptions with religious zealotry.
So this is expert opinion. So this is expert opinion. I can link you expert opinion on someone saying that the advent of starch-based calories increased our brain sizes. So it's now your expert opinion against my expert opinion. Should we just do an expert opinion face-off?
I don't think I kind of agree with that. I think the consumption of extra carbohydrates in conjunction with already native animal food diet, that increase in calories or total caloric intake most definitely contributed, but it wasn't the principal factor. I mean, I linked probably 50 studies half an hour ago.
So agriculture and starches and abundant calories increased our brain size, but also decreased our brain size and stature. Which is it?
No, it's a 1-2 thing. So if you're getting your adequate EPA, DHA, fat-soluble vitamins, saturated fat, the thing that makes up your brain, I mean, your brain's pure cholesterol, saturated fat, and phospholipids in EPA and DHA forms. That's what constitutes your brain. There's not a single nutrient in a sweet potato that could constitute growing the brain size. I'm saying the additional calories in conjunction with those foods, in conjunction with the starches and the carbohydrates intermittently that we had access to, yeah, it contributed a small part, but it wasn't the primary driver for our brain size increasing. I mean, there's evidence of us looking at stone tool usage and the correlation with brain size because we were able to bust open bones and get access to the bone marrow, which was another really important factor in human brain size growth. There's the fact that we have evidence that we are scavengers. We were running around busting skulls open and eating brains. What you're saying is, hold on, man.
We both need to talk a bit backwards and forwards here. Like the monologues are a bit hard to approach because there's too much on the table. Like my list of stuff that we've covered is now impenetrably large, and we haven't even covered some of the stuff that you said in your initial paragraph or your opening statement. Right. So you're saying that there's a whole bunch of different factors that could have contributed to our development as a species. Right. I agree. There's a whole bunch of different things. So we can't point to one particular thing and say, therefore, this is the reason why, therefore we should eat a diet comprised of solely animal foods. Right. We
no, not solely. I'm not advocating for that. I think we should follow the metric of seasonal availability. Like, I mean, I wouldn't be against people taking a month out of the year and eating a fuck ton of plants. Like, there are beneficial effects that can come from the consumption of plants through hormesis, but hormesis stops working
let's tackle if it's
continually tickled.
We need to go point by point because it's just every time you talk, you say 15 new things. So we need to go point by point. You just said the seasonal nature of fruits and vegetables. That's just something basic, something we can actually discuss. Let's look at that. So apples, September to November. and then collard greens, December to May. You've got corn, June to August. In September, you've got cauliflowers and carrots and cabbage.
Cauliflower didn't exist 10,000 years ago.
Yeah, well, I'm just doing a modern one. So mushrooms all year round, onions, January, February, March, April, May, and December. Oranges, December, January, February. So all year round, we have fruits and vegetables. All like literally, there's a fruit.
That's modern, man. We're talking about the evolutionary context. All the fruits and vegetables you eat today didn't exist.
Like, yeah, sure, but they're going to have the heirloom varieties or the varieties that preceded the modern varieties, right? Existed. They didn't just pop out of nowhere, right? So we had all of these things. They just were in slightly different, more antiquated forms than our modern, highly selectively bred forms. But we had berries in the summer, and strawberries go from April to August, right? So we had strawberries for quite a few months, 5 months a year. And we had other berries in the summer, and then in the winter we had like sweet potatoes run from September to February, and like starchy tubers, like a sweet potato, incredibly important in human evolution. And so, and that was just from September to February. But then we have between March and August, we have other starchy or sugar-based foods. So we can actually consume carbohydrate all year round. So
we can now, but we're not able to before. And if you look at what caused humans to evolve, it was climate change. Here, I can explain the timeline. Like, what started the initial evolution of human history, what forced primates out of the trees into the grasslands, was climate change, which reduced our access and availability to plant foods. So I'm arguing that because we did not have a consistent source of fruits, vegetables, and other plant foods to consume, we were forced to move to eating meat. And over millions of years, slowly, we went from being both omnivores, eating a lot of plants and animal foods in between, to being more principally carnivores, eating a lot of animal foods and then plant foods as a fallback intermittently. And then we discovered how to cook and process starch. I mean, if you look at the digestibility of starch, unless you cook it, it's like, 25% is what you can digest. And we didn't have cooking technology until like 300, 400,000 years ago. So I do think that plant foods did play a role, but I think the fundamental driver of human evolution, and it still is true today, it's not like we can just change our genetics in 10,000 years and be able to consume hyper amounts of plant foods, was a consumption of meat.
Okay, well, are you contributing climate change to the fact that we had an ice age and no longer have an ice age, or do you mean that there was more subtle climate change?
No, I mean, it's been pretty widely variable. Like, we've had obviously the ice age. We've had periods of intense heat, which obviously killed much of the plants too. And I do agree. Like, depending on the location, like there's geographical differences depending on where you're at. Like, plant foods that are available in Thailand would not be the same ones that were available in the United States. Like, it's pretty widely variable. But the consistent theme across all of evolutionary history was that we lost access to our consistent source of plant foods, fruits, like we were in our early hominid form, which we were consuming lots of fiber, which, mind you, the consumption of fiber in primates is solely to make butyrate, which is a saturated fat. So we were essentially a primate that was consuming fiber in order to get our saturated fat intake, to being forced out of the trees, not consuming as much fiber, and then being forced to get our saturated fat intake from animal foods. And that was the primary driver of human evolution, was the consumption.
Right. So we've said, again, I feel like I have to keep saying we need to go point by point because you just raised a whole bunch of different points. Let's go back to the Ice Age, right? So the Ice Age was 2.4 million years ago. Humankind isn't that old, right? So if we're going to talk about humankind, are we going to be talking about like within the last 100,000 years, or what is the time frame for humankind?
Yeah, I mean, I hear what you're saying. Yeah, I mean, like, it's hard to quantify. A lot of people don't quantify the early hominids. I equate the early, like, Australopithecus, the early human forms. Like, I mean, it's pretty clear which ones were the ones that persisted and which ones were the ones that died off, and that's why I bring back the isotopic data.
That's going back quite far, because at that point there were just fruit.
Yeah,
right? There were fruit givers at that point.
Yeah, I can further explain though. So that's why I'm saying the climate change drive was probably the most principal important thing in determining human evolution. Like I said, when you lose access to your consistent food source, you're forced to go out and try to survive on a different food source, and that was principally animal food. So I might be missing.
Yeah, but wait, this doesn't make any sense. So basically, what you're saying is because of the ice age, the climate has warmed since then, right? Because modern humans or Homo sapiens weren't around during the ice age because it was 2.4 million years ago, right? So we were only around more recently, and we would have not been around in the ice age. And the start of our human ancestors were purely frugivorous, right? So, and you agree with that. So that means that
Initially,
climate change doesn't have anything to do with forcing us out of our zones of habitation, right, from the African savanna, wherever. We weren't forced out of Africa because of climate change, because that was 2.4 million years ago, and Homo sapiens are a lot more modern than that. And so we evolved from being frugivorous to eating cooked food and arguably animal foods and stuff like this, right? But
there's a lot of time in between there. A lot of time and a lot of different species in between that.
Yeah, there's a lot of time. There's 100,000 years in between there, right, of development. But the Ice Age was quite clear of that, right, in Africa.
Well, this is, again, it's hard to specifically say, but we know that there was massive amounts of climate change that reduced access to food availability. And if you look at where human evolution started, it was in the southern tip of Africa, and through climate change and being forced out of our rainforest, out of our native food source, animals were forced from the trees into the grasslands to hunt for food, and they got it principally from animal products.
That's speculation, by the way. That's speculation.
It is not, dude.
No, that's speculation and not fact. So you're now asserting Paleolithic speculation as fact, which you're not in a position to do, right? There's various different theories, and none of them, we only have fragments of evidence to support any theory. So when you're just going to come along and say this is fact, that humans were forced out of their habitation into the grasslands to hunt animals, and that is fact, no, it's not. That's speculation.
It's not. Dude, here's the thing, man. If you look at, again, the isotopic data, which you seem to dismiss, our early hominids,
it's been thoroughly rejected by the scientific community as a whole.
Perhaps by the plant-based community, but there are people who are looking at the large-scale picture of human evolution, what nutrients are required to drive human evolution, and really what we had access to and what tools we used and the drive for hunting. So starting with the first principal hominid, I think it was something A. ramidus. That was one of the first species that broke off from the human race, and they died out because they were still tied to their plant-based consumption diet. It wasn't until we got to Australopithecus afarensis is when we started consuming more animal foods, and that's what broke off into the separate tier. There's two separation points from Australopithecus afarensis. There was the Perinthampra, I think it's Para something robustus, and then there was the boisei. Those two were primarily plant-consuming hominids, and they also died out. The only species that persisted throughout evolutionary history were the ones that focused as heavily as possible on animal foods. And there's also evidence of humans hunting the Neanderthals out of existence and consuming them. Really, humans were the apex carnivores. There was this beautiful system of hunting, meat consumption, driving human evolution and intelligence, all coinciding together to where the species that were the ones that were propagating the most, that were reproducing the most, that were surviving, were all the ones that were consuming principally heavy amounts of animal food. The species that didn't consume animal foods in the same level were not as smart. They died off. They weren't able to support their diet, and that's how you have humans today.
Wait. So you just made a claim. You made a claim that modern humans were the apex predators and they were eating Neanderthals, or were you saying they weren't eating Neanderthals? They were just hunting them for competition? Or can you clarify that just really quickly?
Yeah, humans, the current Homo habilis was the most recent species of human that consumed and ate, Homo erectus was the first species of human, not habilis. Habilis died off too because they were not able to keep up or nor as intelligent or capable of hunting. But the Paranthropus, that species that shifted off from the initial Australopithecus, they were heavily plant-based Neanderthals. Like, they're heavily plant-based early hominids, and we hunted them to extinction. The humans that hunted the other plant-based hominids were the ones that propagated and furthered the evolution of their species.
Okay, so what you just said is factually incorrect, because Neanderthals survived up until around 30,000 years ago, whereas Homo erectus went extinct much before that time period.
No, it's not true either. Here, I'll link you the timeline.
Well, based upon the evidence I'm looking at, Homo erectus, like Neanderthals, were much later than Homo erectus. Homo erectus was like the hold on, that's I'm pretty sure. Hold on, I'm just going to look at the timeline myself. Well, you've linked a timeline in the chat, have you? Oh, you've just linked it now.
Yeah, that's
okay.
One.
Yeah, I think I've seen this one. I think this one is potentially credible. Yeah. Yeah, so you can see that Homo erectus died off before the Neanderthals. So if your claim was that Homo erectus killed off the Neanderthals, you can quite clearly see that's a false claim.
No, the Homo neanderthalensis, the two species that were left over at the end, when I was referencing Neanderthals, they died off prior to Homo sapiens. And like I said, there's evidence of us hunting the Neanderthals and consuming them. Like, that was another principal driver that made humans what they are today, is because we were apex carnivores at the top of the heap. We had access to tools, technology, various methods of trapping animals and eating them.
I just want to go back to the claim before we move on. I want to go back to the claim about Neanderthals. They died out about 30,000 years ago, right?
Right, because we ate them.
So we ate them 30,000 years ago. But what were you saying then about Homo erectus hunting them?
No, there was like I said, it's a bottleneck between the development of human intelligence, and that's why I said it's a causal factor from like three different directions. Hunting required creativity and intelligence to procure foods. Like, the species that was the most intelligent was the one that was more able to procure those high fat soluble vitamin, high nutrient dense food.
That's speculation.
It's not. I mean, like,
no. Look. So you've you've linked expert opinion about eating saturated fat or whatever, and I can link expert opinion about eating starch, and you've even partly agreed with me that starch could be a key point in our evolution, and you're just spamming you're spamming like tabloid articles at this point.
Okay, so on that note then, this seems like a good way to segue into something about ethics for a little while, if you guys are game. Do you want to get into that perhaps?
The way that I see the ethical argument at this point, like, if Dolan is just gonna keep coming back to the fact that we're obligate carnivores, or I can't remember the exact phrase that you use, but if you're going to come back to that, then the ethics are moot, because basically, if we don't eat animal foods, we die. So that's why the health argument is more important than the ethical argument, because if he's convinced that if we don't eat animal foods, we die, then I don't really have much of an ethical case apart from die for veganism, right? Die for your belief, which I don't think is so compelling outside of like die-hard vegans. And I don't find that particularly persuasive. But just the claim in itself, like, we're getting caught up with specific things, with looking at the ancestry of humankind, stating speculative potential things from tabloids, newspaper articles as fact about our history, which no one has 100%.
These are studies, man. They're not tabloid
articles.
There's
speculation. There's lots of speculation, and some of it I agree with, some of it I don't. And there's a lot of there's not consensus on this, right? So there's a lot of speculation, but there's not consensus. And we're talking about certain specific health claims and stuff. But the elephant in the room still is the epidemiological research, or just even the fact that I haven't eaten any meat in 10 years, right? I've not been vegan for 10 years, 9 years or something. And but I haven't eaten any meat, I think maybe even for 11 years if you exclude fish, like actual like red meat and these saturated fat cholesterol foods that you think that I need cholesterol from, right? And I haven't suffered any negative health consequences whatsoever. And we can look at.
You have no health issues at all? Like, I don't know a single person who doesn't struggle with health issues.
Have you been taking supplements?
The only supplement that I take is B12, and I recommend that meat eaters also make sure they get enough B12, because there's evidence to suggest that well, actually, it's not just evidence to suggest, but the largest demographic in absolute figures who are B12 deficient clinically are meat eaters, right? Full stop. Inarguable. But
link that. Please link that.
Well, it's just what? So you're saying the population of the entire world who have the potential to have B12 deficiency versus some tiny subset of the population who are vegans have more B12 deficiency, right? If you go to any doctor's place, like when I self-diagnosed myself as having low B12 and I went to the doctors to get a uric MMA test, they were like, oh yeah, you want B12? They had a whole fucking cabinet of B12. And I was probably the only vegan in the village. They had a fucking cabinet of the shit. Injections.
What's the proportionality though?
The proportionality is the biggest demographic of people with B12 deficiency are meat eaters, like by far. I could find a figure for you, but I don't even.
Okay, let's not worry about that too much for the time.
Yeah.
What I do want to make sure of is if you guys are both game for it, either you go on to ethics or we open it up to Q&A.
Yeah, I'd be more in favour of a Q&A, because I think as I've just said, the ethical argument will just come down to you're going to die as a vegan, despite the fact that I'm not dead. My friends.
Oh, I don't think you'll die. I think humans are very resilient. Like, I do not disagree that you can survive on a vegan diet. We're speaking totally for optimal health. What makes you an optimal?
Yeah, sure. So I think what we should do is I'm just going to quickly wrap this health thing up from my perspective, and then Dolan can have a closing statement.
Both of you make closing statements. Then I think we'll go straight to the Q&A. Is that okay with?
And then we'll do. Then we'll do a quick Q&A, and then I'm going to eat some coconut curry.
That's fine. Footsoldier, you go ahead. You make your closing statement.
Yeah, from my point of view, you're asserting that a vegan diet is deficient in certain nutrients. I'm not deficient in any nutrients. And you're asserting that it will not provide me with an optimal level of health. And from my own anecdotal experience, because you're talking about me, so I have to give my anecdotal experience. Obviously, I can point you to more of the medical literature, broader epidemiological medical literature, to show that this is supported also in the scientific literature. But this is from my anecdotal experience, because we are talking about me here. Before I went vegan or plant-based, whatever you want to call it, back in around 2010, I actually had similar issues to what you were describing. I had chronic joint pain in my back. I had intestinal issues. I had, like, for example, occasionally like blood in my stool, loose bowel movements, abdominal pain throughout my entire teenage years, to the point where I was just like doubled over in pain sometimes. I had to go, well, I didn't have to go, but I went to the hospital, I think twice. I got in an MRI scanner thingy, the CAT scan thing, the big drum thing, and they couldn't figure out what was wrong with me. I suffered, diarrhea and constipation, and, sometimes it would be constipated, sometimes it would be diarrhea, and sometimes blood. And I suffered from lethargy, like energy issues. I was incredibly unfit. I couldn't run a mile at a decent pace. I couldn't run for the bus without getting completely out of breath and feeling sick. At school, I was always really tired. So I think that's enough of a picture about pre-plant-based diet. And now I've been eating a plant-based diet for approaching 10 years. My my fitness has got objectively better, because I can measure my fitness objectively with watts on the bike, with running times, and stuff like that, which There's no way to fool your running time. You can't just go vegan and accidentally run significantly faster and just reach that by accident without you being fitter. It's entailed within having a faster running time that you have improved your fitness. And in terms of the frequency of being ill, full disclaimer, I got a cold this year, a couple of months ago because, it was about a month ago now, because just the humidity and heat of Granada just completely dried out all of my mucous membrane, like in my nose and everything just felt like fucking dry like a desert, and I just got fucking ill with all the air conditioning on the buses and everything. I just got fucking got a cold. But that was apart from that, and another time, I think about 2014 or something, I haven't been ill like very much, and when I do get ill, it's a cold and it lasts for a few days and then goes away. Versus previously, I was ill all the fucking time, like most people are, like at least a couple of colds a year or whatever. And in terms of all the back pain and the stomach issues and the digestive issues and all of that, practically all gone away. I don't suffer from chronic back pain at all. I don't have joint pain in my lower back or upper back like I used to have at all. Never suffer from constipation ever now. Occasionally, if I might upset my stomach, like once in a blue moon, and then suffer like very mild digestive upset. But generally speaking, I'm like, how my level of health now, after almost 10 years on a plant-based diet, is just not comparable to how I used to be. Just like so much better on so many different levels. And so my anecdotal experience would just be profound increase in overall health. So the claim that I am not going to reach optimal health unless I eat animal foods has been the opposite of my personal experience. And the broader medical literature supports the idea that a plant-based diet is healthy, contributes to higher quality of health with lower rates of disease. And the largest nutrition organizations in the world, the American Dietetics Association, has released peer-reviewed statements saying that vegan diet is adequate for all stages of life, including athletes, pregnant women, and infants. So that's my closing statement. Dolan, you've got the floor.
Yeah, thank you for your closing statement, Footsoldier. Message received and understood. Dolan, the next couple of minutes is yours to close off, and then we'll open it up to Q&A.
Yeah, man, I find it funny how both sides have their anecdotal experience saying the vegan diet radically improved your health. And I can give you my similar timeline. Like, I had the first couple of months when I started cutting out sugar and all the processed food and all the crap that I was eating, and I went plant-based, I did feel better the first couple of months. Like, I had a reduction in some of my symptoms. I had somewhat better mood, less anxiety, all that. So I do empathize and do understand that some people can go from a shit diet to feeling much better on a vegan diet. I don't discount that one bit. But I went through pretty much every diet there is prior. Like, I've been obsessed with testing myself and trying to figure out what foods I can tolerate for like 6 or 7 years now, just trying to figure out how I can fix my issues. And like, I've always been I was kind of up and down. I mean, when I was born, I essentially had like pre-pneumonia when I was born. I was born a C-section baby, and I didn't get as much breast milk I was supposed to. I was given some soy formula like in between. And when I turned 2 years old, I got pretty gnarly pneumonia, and like, I don't know what it's called, like pleural effusion, where there's water around your heart. And I had to get my side cut open, get a bunch of fluid sucked out of my lungs and my chest cavity. Otherwise I was going to die. So I have a pretty like long, lengthy health history, so I'll try to keep it short. But like I said, for most of my childhood, like, I always had weird aches and pains. I always had weird joint pain intermittently. Like, I started having most of my symptoms like started to slowly creep up. I have an autoimmune condition called ankylosing spondylitis, and I distinctly remember I was 13 years old. I was in wrestling practice, and something had happened. Like, I got moved in an awkward way that gave me like some of the most horrific back pain in my life. Like, it was to the point where I had to lay down. If I stood up and took a deep breath, it felt like I was getting like felt like someone had their hands on my spine. Like, like they were grinding my spine with their hands. And I had health issues, I mean, pretty much all through my teen years. Like when I turned 18, 19, like I had pretty bad acne. I had depression. I was a little bit overweight. Like I wasn't fat, but I was like skinny fat, pretty pudgy. And like I said, throughout most of college, I was eating bad food, and I was desperate to try and figure out my acne and my digestive issues. So I went to a doctor, and they gave me antibiotics, and a large portion of my issues escalated dramatically after that. And really from that point on, like from about, I'm almost 27 now, from like age 20 until now, I've tried veganism, I tried vegetarian diets, I tried keto, a lot of plant foods. I did variations of the Mediterranean diet, like there and in between, and none of it resolved all my issues. Like in terms of the list of problems that I had, like throughout this whole period, like I always slept terribly. I never felt like I got a good night's rest. I'd wake up in the morning and have pretty bad morning anxiety. I would wake up and just not want to do anything for the day. Like I just wake up and have this sense of doom that would take a couple hours to go away. And then I would usually end up feeling better by the end of the night. But that had never gone away until I did meat only. I had really bad fatigue. I know, like you said, I mean, I'd wake up in the morning and my eyes would be burning. I would have itchy skin. Like I had a little bit of psoriasis or eczema. I never got it diagnosed, but I always had some like on my cheek or on the back of my arms or my legs. I had no sense of smell. I couldn't smell anything. I had pretty bad sense of taste too because of that. I could never breathe through my nose. And I don't know if you've read about breathing through your mouth when you go to sleep at night, but it's definitely not good for your brain or even heart disease. Like people who breathe through their mouth are more likely to have heart disease. So I've had a lot of shitty symptoms that I too have been trying to figure out. And like I said, when I did the vegetarian plant-based thing, it made no difference after the first couple of months. Like I had a little bit of a reduction, and then I had